So good afternoon. Welcome to Brooklands Museum. Welcome to you for coming and joining us to celebrate the launch of this wonderful book by this extremely wonderful man. I'm not going to talk for long. I'm literally going to say welcome and thank you before I pass over to the wonderful man who has written this wonderful book. Now, just Nigel Spooner.
Anyway, thank you for all for coming in. The weather has conspired against us, of course, today. Shame about the flying, but never mind. And we also, some of the volunteers who we've been inviting, of course, are working today, this afternoon. So they may be able to pop in, I guess, at some stage. A special thank you to Tamley for coming along today as well. And as you'll see, Tamley was in right at the beginning of this crazy idea. So it's particularly nice to have you here today, Tamley. Thank you. So we're going to talk about this, the book. The giveaway is the title, A History of Aviation at Brooklands in 100 Objects. And I'm going to explain a bit about the background of Brooklands. Now, I do realise that most of you will know a lot of this. So you're in a position to point out when I get things wrong, but equally there are some of you who don't know the full story of aviation at Brooklands, so it's worth going through the slides. This is not, I hasten to add, a typical PowerPoint set with multiple bulleted lists on every slide. It's mostly pictures, so I'm going to be talking to those. Okay, so here's the book. This is what it ended up looking like, and I'll explain a bit later on how it got to look like this and how it got to contain what it contains. But what we're going to go through is, as I say, the history of aviation at Brooklands, just a quick rampage through 80 years of history on the site. Talk about the museum, how it was set up, how it got to be what it is today, and then a bit, not too much, I promise you, about me and how I came to be a volunteer here and ended up writing a book, which was not part, I hasten to add, of the original plan. We'll talk a bit about the book, and I'll show you some examples of pages, which will be familiar to those of you who've very kindly acquired a copy already. And then if there are any questions at the end, there should be time for that too. It'll be fairly brief, 3 or 4 hours should do it, so hope all is well. I want to start though with this. Now this, some of you may recognise this as being an exhibit on the Vickers Viscount in the aircraft park. And this is a list of airline fares from 1959. So that is, 65 years ago, roughly. And if I zoom in, look at the numbers here. Now this is for British European Airways, which was the kind of cartel state airline in 1959. There was very little competition for airfares, and they were really much the same whoever you travelled with. But I just want to point out some of these numbers, and this is, I add, 1959. So we've got Athens, £56 single. We've got Barcelona, £23, Madrid, £29, and so on. Now, I had a look on a website last night, and you can get fares almost exactly the same number of pounds today, be it on Ryanair or Wizz or EasyJet or whatever, to some of these places. And you say, well, okay, yeah, it's the same number of pounds, great. 65 years ago, this is what inflation, courtesy of the Bank of England inflation calculator, has turned those numbers in today. And I think probably we would all tremble a bit about being asked to pay over £1,000 for a single airline fare to Athens. What this means is actually that flying is about somewhere between 15 and 20 times cheaper in real terms today than it was in 1959. How did that come about? Not many things you can say are 20 times cheaper relatively now than they were 65 years ago. A lot of the answers to that were developed here at Brooklands, and I'm going to touch on those in a moment. But where did it start? Well, it started here. This is Brooklands House It still exists just over the railway line from here. It is now part of Brooklands College, but in the early part of the 20th century, it was a typical Victorian country pile. Large house, rather a magnificent kitchen garden here, I think. Fairly extraordinary. I think that's probably now a housing estate or something, but the house nonetheless is here. And it was owned by this chap, Hugh Lock King, pipe smoker extraordinaire, as you can see, but also a very keen driver of motor cars. Motor cars in 1907 were relatively new, but there were a load of enthusiasts around, and he and his fellow enthusiasts were extremely annoyed by the fact that in this country you were not allowed to drive a motor car faster than 20 miles an hour, whereas on the continent, dear old Johnny Foreigner was allowed to drive as fast as he could, and they thought that was rather unfair. So they convinced Hugh Lock King here that since he had this magnificent country estate with a large area of farmland, that he could turn that into a racing circuit at his own expense, I hasten to add. And boy, was it an expense when the time came. And this is what he came up with. Now, this is a slightly strange picture of Brooklands. The perspective is significantly distorted, but you can just about make out things like the Members Bridge, what was the restaurant at the top of the hill, and the building here, the clubhouse, which is just the other side of that wall. The river, as you can see in those days, was doing all sorts of funny things, and the railway straight appeared to be heading south when in fact it heads east-west. But we'll give that a miss. This is actually what part of it looks like today. I just thought I'd have a bit of fun with an overlay. But the thing about this is that, of course, it was purely for racing cars, and it opened in 1907 for that particular purpose. But there was one person who was at the opening of the racetrack who wanted to use it for something else, and he'd heard that the weather conditions, peculiarly at Brooklands, were such that the air was very still in the morning. And he thought, well, that's a good idea. I can use that to fly this thing that I built called an aeroplane. His name was Elliot Verdon Roe. Actually, he was Edwin Elliot Verdon Roe, but he never used the Edwin, which is just as well, because otherwise we'd never have got the firm of Avro. It would be Evro, which would be not terribly convenient. But Elliot Verdon Roe, he decided, having built some model aeroplanes, he'd build a full-size one in Putney at his brother's house, and that he would bring it here to Brooklands to try and fly it. To do that, he got permission to build a shed on the course, which is, back a bit, press the wrong button, apologies. And there he is with his aeroplane on the finishing straight. There is considerable doubt as to whether he actually flew it in terms of controlled flight. He, some years later, claimed he had, but the Aero Club of Great Britain decided he hadn't, and therefore they didn't acknowledge the fact. He certainly got it in the air, but probably towing it behind a car. If you go into the paddock in front of the clubhouse, you'll find there's a little brick plinth that has got a plaque on it celebrating the event. It's a bit difficult to read, so I mocked up this replica, but you'll see the words are very carefully chosen not to say that he did actually achieve controlled flight. I'm told actually this is not the original plaque, that there was one that did make the claim that was replaced sometime later, but I've never been able to prove that. Anyway, so Elliot Verdon Roe was at least trying to fly aeroplanes on the site, and others quickly took up the cudgels. Here we've got a load of sheds that were built on the site. One of the people that came here was a chap called Blériot, Monsieur Blériot from France, and this is one of his Blériot monoplanes. We have a replica in the aircraft factory. And another person that came to learn to fly and set up his own shed to start an aeroplane business was this chap, Thomas Sopwith, Sir Tom Sopwith he became. He had loads of money, luckily, and he set up here building aircraft, but actually very quickly decided Brooklands wasn't big enough for his aspirations, and he bought a new property in Kingston upon Thames. But of course, Kingston upon Thames is rather short of runways, so every aircraft that Sopwith built, almost without exception, was brought here on a truck and flown from here in Brooklands. and that continued when Sopwiths became hawkers after the First World War. We also had a restaurant here, the Bluebird restaurant, and I'm showing this picture actually not because of the restaurant, but because of this little shed here. This is the world's first flight ticket office. In 1911, Keith Prowse, who I think is still going as ticket purveyors, decided that there was money to be made from pleasure flights. And to do that, they built this wee shed here and sold tickets at Brooklands. And the shed, I'm glad to say, is still here. I mean, it's been moved from its original site, but it still exists underneath the nose of Concorde. Very quickly, though, in this particular episode, as we come up to the First World War, there was a need to build military aircraft. And this, I'm putting up, this is an aeroplane with the rather unfriendly name of BE-2C. Trips off the tongue, doesn't it? It was designed by the Royal Aircraft Factory at Farnborough. Farnborough, in spite of its name, didn't have much in the way of facilities to build aircraft in larger numbers in 1914, so they contracted with a company called Vickers Armstrongs. Vickers Armstrongs at that stage were based in Kent, and they were building aeroplanes of their own design, particularly an aeroplane called the Vickers Gun Bus, and therefore they had no room to take on this contract to build the BE-2C. So they came to Brooklands and they bought up an old car factory on the periphery of the site, the Atala Car Works. And that became the first source of Vickers Armstrong's building aircraft on this site, the beginning of the First World War. If we move on, though, after the war, this is roughly what the site looked like. And we, for example, are about here on this particular picture. There's the clubhouse. You can see over the duration of the war, a number of sheds and hangars were built up here on what was called the aircraft village or the aviation village, including some sheds here put up for the use of hawkers that were used ultimately to build things like Hurricanes. Crucially, though, this is perhaps one of the first very famous aircraft that were developed at Brooklands. Not initially, they were initially developed in Kent, but came to be built here at Brooklands. They were designed by this chap, Rex Pearson, one of the 6 designers that I've covered in the book, was the designer of the Vickers Vimy. And I'm going to try a bit of audience participation now. Who's ever flown the Atlantic? Most of you. Yes, you have. Who's ever flown the Atlantic in an aeroplane driven by propellers? Didn't think so. You'd have to be of an age, and it would probably be in a thing called a Britannia.
Britannia.
Yeah? If you had, you might be interested to know that here at the back, everyone turn round, maybe you knew this, but what we have here, and I hesitate even to touch it, this is actually the first propeller that ever flew the Atlantic. And it flew on a Vickers Vimy that was flown by 2 gentlemen called Alcock and Brown. And they managed to make it across the Atlantic without crashing and landed on a bog in Ireland. But that, I'm proud to say, is the original propeller of their aircraft. Quite how it's ended up here and not on the original aircraft in the Science Museum, I don't know, but Tamley may know, but I'm glad we've got it. But also between the wars, they had lots of fun. Now what we've got here is the original Aero Clubhouse, built 1932, I think, to encourage the use of flying in light aircraft. It's still there. It's across the other side of the site. It's beautifully preserved. It's a listed building, and I think is used as an office by a design company at the moment. But it is still there. Here it was on the Brooklands site, and this was what they call a dawn patrol, where everyone got up really early, jumped in their aeroplanes and flew to someone else's airfield before they woke up. All jolly good fun. Incidentally, these are aeroplanes called moths. De Havilland moths became de Havilland tiger moths and became rather more famous, but these were the previous version. And this is actually an aeroplane called an Avro Avian. And Avro, of course, was the company set up by the aforementioned Elliott Verdon Roe, who used his name as the aircraft company name. This is one of his early, rather commercial aircraft that he built. Not as good as a Tiger Moth, I hasten to add, but getting that way. Also being flown from here, not built here, these were built in Kingston, but being flown from here were these rather beautiful biplanes called Hawker Furies. And we have a remarkably good replica of one in the flight shed. They were designed by this chap. Sidney Cam, later Sir Sidney Cam, was the chief designer at Hawkers, which is the company that Sopwiths had become after the First World War. And Sidney Cam, remarkable chap, pretty much self-taught as an aircraft designer, but he had an eye for building, well, firstly, what I think is one of the most beautiful biplanes, very sleek, streamlined, beautifully put together. But he thought he could do better than that, and he came up with an idea for an aeroplane that he called the Fury monoplane. And this is the Fury monoplane because ultimately it was named the Hurricane. And this Hawker Hurricane, not this particular one, this is an early model, but the prototype was built in a building in Kingston upon Thames that still exists. You can go and see it. It's not got a plaque on it or anything, but it is still there. And again, was brought here on a truck for its first flight in the mid-1930s. Also built here was this remarkable aeroplane. This is the Vickers Wellington bomber. It was designed by Rex Pearson using a structural system devised by a chap called Barnes Wallis, who we'll be talking about a bit more in a moment. And it was one of the most successful bombers during the Second World War. It was in production for the whole of the war. There were 11,461 built, and I think we are agreed, chaps, now that that's the right number, aren't we? I'm looking for some nods there. I hope it is. I mentioned Barnes Wallis, so we've got into the Second World War now, and here is a very familiar picture of Barnes Wallis, actually taken after the war when he was in the clubhouse here in his office on the first floor. What's interesting about this picture is what's on the wall behind him, and this, although it's difficult to make out, is actually the reconnaissance picture, a very famous reconnaissance picture taken the day after the dams raid in Germany, where the Mona Dam, which is shown here, was destroyed by what we know as the bouncing bomb, technically a ricocheting depth charge designed by Barnes Wallis. And he was in the clubhouse heading up the new development and experimental department. In the meantime, his and Rex Pearson's Vickers Wellington was being subject to a number of indignities in the interests of developing various new things during the war. Now, this is a Vickers Wellington bomber. It's unusual in one respect in that it has got Rolls-Royce Merlin engines instead of great big radial engines. But what is of more interest is what's going on here. It's had its rear turret removed, some air intakes provided, and the giveaway is what's going on here at the end, which is a jet exhaust. And it was testing one of these. This is known as a Whittle W2 engine. Designed by Frank Whittle during the Second World War, doesn't look much like a jet engine as we know it. And in fact, it's quite difficult to spot even where the air went in. There's a thing that looks like a colander here, which is a grid over the air intake. Quite how they expected the air to get in smoothly when they put all this clutter on the front, I do not know. But the fact is that it worked. It was tested in a Wellington. The Wellington could fly on the power of the Whittle W2 on its own. So when the chaps wanted a jolly jape, they used to fly up to about 10,000 feet, turn off the Merlin engines, cruise along with the propellers stopped on the power of the Whittle W2 and surprise a number of pilots in Spitfires and Hurricanes and so on. Ho, ho, ho. But also more seriously, as the war was ending, there was a recognition that we would need some civil aircraft after the war. During the war, as you may know, the Americans had most of the responsibility for developing transport aircraft. We didn't. We were just doing bombers. And there was a need for a kind of stopgap. And this, believe it or not, is a development of the Vickers Wellington bomber. They basically took the wings, the tailplane, and put a new fuselage, metal fuselage, unpressurised on it, and formed the Vickers Viking. And it was actually remarkably successful. And in its various guises, there are about 415 Vikings and Vallettas, which was the military version, built. So a not insignificant number. I'm putting these numbers up, by the way, for a reason that you'll see right at the end. But the Viking really was just a support act for what was to come. And this is the remarkable Vickers Viscount. The Viscount was developed by the chap here on the right. This is George Edwards, later Sir George Edwards, who played a major role here at Brooklands for many years, both as chief designer, chief engineer, director, and ultimately chairman. He's sitting here, actually, this chap is Frank Whittle, the inventor of the turbojet. And they're sitting in seats 2A and 2B, I think, on the Viscount, on one of its early proving flights. You can see the huge windows here that proves it's on the Viscount. George Edwards was a great supporter of the gas turbine engine, as he would insist on calling it. And he had to fight very hard to ensure that the Vickers Viscount kept its Rolls-Royce Dart turbine engines when most other people were saying newfangled stuff, never work, blah, blah, blah. He hung out for it, and he was right, because there were 445 Viscounts built, and a significant number of those went to airlines in America. It was a real breakthrough aircraft. George Edwards didn't stop there. He was asked to design a new bomber to carry the new atomic weapons that were coming into play in the 1950s. And the government decided that they would ask 3 companies to build V-bombers, or to propose V-bombers. Vickers here at Brooklands, Avro, and Handley Page. The Vickers one was first, and it was what George Edwards described it as an unfunny aeroplane, in that it wasn't dramatic like the Avro Vulcan, it wasn't super clever aerodynamically like the Handley Page Victor, but it did the job, and it was way first into service. We have, as you know, the nose cone of the final Vickers Valiant to be built, and that's in the aircraft factory. I wish we had the rest of it, but there we go. But I'm bringing this chap back in again, because while all this is going on and George Edwards is designing unfunny aeroplanes, Barnes Wallis is still in advanced dream world, really. I mean, he is devising aircraft that, in his view, could fly from London to Australia and back in 10 hours. Now, we cannot do that even yet, but he thought we could. He had this idea for what he called a wing-controlled aerodyne, which is really his description of this remarkable thing, which is a design called the Swallow. And it was designed with swing wings and its engines mounted on the end of it. And one doesn't really want to think about the engineering challenges that might have presented full size. But a lot of good aerodynamic work went into that ultimately got used on the Concorde program and so on. George Edwards, in the meantime, designed a bigger Viscount. This is the Vickers Vanguard. Now, this should have been an extraordinarily good aircraft. It was big, it was fast, it had very low seat mile costs. It should have swept the world commercially. But the trouble was that the crafty French had snuck in with an aeroplane called the Caravelle, which was a pure jet, a rather beautiful aeroplane. I should have put a picture up, shouldn't I? A rather beautiful aeroplane with 2 jets at the back. And all of a sudden, everyone wanted jets, even though they were less economical. The poor old Vanguard provided good service for BEA, Trans-Canada Airlines, and ultimately ended up, as the one we have here, as a freighter. 44 built, not enough to be commercially attractive. But let's move on. We get to the final sort of historical episode now. This is Brooklands. This is a view from the other direction to the other ones I've shown. But you can see that here in the 1970s, we have a huge factory over on the side here. This is where the original aircraft village was. You can't really see it, but where my pointer is the old 1932 clubhouse. Again, it's still there. Everything else has gone and been replaced, but it was still there then. And we're currently up here somewhere. There's the strat chamber, so we're right up in this corner of the site. But the writing was on the wall. We had the VC-10. Now the VC-10, fascinating aircraft, again, aerodynamically hugely impressive. But it was designed very specifically to be able to take off from Nairobi Airport with its short runway in midsummer. Nairobi Airport is quite high up, so the air is very thin. In the midsummer it's very hot, so it needed to have a huge wing just to get it off the ground. That was great. George Edwards came up with this very clever design that had the engines at the back, like the Caravelle, and it had an extremely efficient wing with lots of high lift devices. And it could indeed get off the Nairobi runway in midsummer. It also meant, by the way, that it could get off the very short Brooklands runway in midwinter as well, if it needed to, which it did. But again, it was not a huge success because, frankly, not that many people wanted to fly to Nairobi in midsummer. And Boeing, for instance, in America came up with the Boeing 707, which was far less clever aerodynamically, cost a whole lot more to run, but which could get into and out of the airports where the Americans had very kindly suggested they might like to lengthen the runways. So fairly unsporting of them, but never mind. Unfortunately, it meant that in the end, only 54 VC-10s were built, VC-10s and super VC-10s. They did, however, actually go on in service for a long time. For 50 years, they served with the Royal Air Force, for instance, firstly as transports and then as tankers. So it was a useful aeroplane, but not a commercially terribly desirable one. Then we had the good old BAC 111. Now I mention this because it wasn't actually a British Aircraft Corporation design. British Aircraft Corporation was what Vickers had become as a consortium. This started life being designed by a company called Hunting's, which was quite a small aircraft provider. They had developed an idea for an aircraft called the Hunting 107. And George Edwards, when Hunting became part of BAC, said, hang on a minute, we can make something of this. So it was developed into what became the BAC 111. And it was built mainly in Bournemouth, not here at Brooklands. But for reasons I'll explain in a moment, they did end up building some here. And in fact, this particular aircraft, November Oscar, as we would call it, actually was the last complete aircraft to be built and flown out of Brooklands. And that was in December 1970. After that, Brooklands only built bits. 244 BAC 111s, so not bad, actually. The thing about it was called the bus stop jet. And it was called that because craftily it had what's called air stairs, built-in steps at the back to get in. There were also air stairs on the front door. And at the back here, although you can't quite see it, it had its own electricity generator called an auxiliary power unit. That meant it didn't need any support at small airports. It could fly in and out, offload and upload its passengers without needing any support. And that made it very attractive to the companies that were beginning to sell cheap tickets to places like the Costa Brava, south of France, and so on. So this was really the beginnings of mass travel by jet aircraft. The engines were getting more efficient, and the aircraft were getting more efficient too, so they could be used for more hours in the day. So a pretty good aeroplane all round, that. But also at the same time here at Brooklands, this magnificent beast was being built in considerable secrecy. This is early 1960s. This is Tactical Strike and Reconnaissance 2, otherwise known as TSR-2, and it was designed to do almost everything short of making a decent cup of tea. That meant it was going to have extraordinarily good aerodynamics and even more extraordinarily good electronics to enable it to do what it was required, which was basically to fly extremely low, very fast, and deliver nuclear bombs to the enemy wherever they might be. It was all going reasonably well, if rather expensively, until in 1965 we had a new Labour government. That sound familiar? And they decided, I think not unreasonably, that the costs were ballooning so much that it could not be afforded. And 6 months after its first flight, which was made not from here, but from Boscombe Down, so the aircraft was built here at Brooklands, taken to Boscombe Down under cover of darkness probably, reassembled at Boscombe Down and flown off. But 6 months after its first flight, it was cancelled. And the government of the day demanded that all the jigs, all the aircraft, all the drawings should be destroyed so that it could never be revived. Luckily, a couple of airframes survived, including this one at Duxford. This is a rather good picture taken, which I bought for the book actually, on the rare occasions when it was taken out of the shed at Duxford, and the photographer, a guy called Darren Harbour, very good air-to-air photographer, took this picture in rather good lighting conditions. When the TSR-2 was cancelled, George Edwards had the challenge of what to do with this massive factory here at Brooklands. And he not only took on building the BAC 111, so taking some of the production away from Herne near Bournemouth, but he also decided that the time had come, with a bit of government encouragement, to do deals with some of the European countries, namely France, Germany and Italy primarily. And of course, although there were a number of aircraft, including the Jaguar, which I'm not going to cover, this was really the prime example. And I don't even need to tell you what it's called. It's one of the few aircraft in history that seems to have lost its definite or indefinite article in front of it. This is just Concorde. It was, of course, an aerodynamic masterpiece, both because it could fly extremely fast and because, as I'll show in a minute, it could also fly rather slowly. And it needed to do both of those things to be successful. Unfortunately, very few countries in the world like the idea of a supersonic aircraft making a boom over their territory, and its routes were hugely limited. And in the end, only 20 were built. The majority of the structure of the Concordes were built here at Brooklands, even though it never flew from here. They were built, put on trucks, and either taken to Filton in Bristol for final assembly in the UK or to Toulouse in France for assembly there. Building 20 of them, of course, made it a commercial failure, sadly. But boy, aren't we glad we've got one here, because it's what brings the punters in. But then we get to here, and this is the end of the history lesson, really. This was a bit of a surprise to me when I started writing this book, was how significant this aircraft is to Brooklands, because this is the Airbus A320 prototype, which was designed by a subset of the Airbus consortium in the 1970s, when they were deciding whether they wanted to build a narrow-bodied jet to complement what they already had, which was an aeroplane called the A300, which was a wide-body jet. They formed a consortium called JET, Joint European Transport, and the design of the wings was put out to a competition of the consortium members. The wing design department was based here at Brooklands, and although the French and I think the Germans competed for the wing design, it was the Brooklands team that won it. They produced the most efficient design of wing for this new proposed aircraft. And so not only did they design the wing, but the first wing sets for the Airbus A320 were built here at Brooklands. Not the aircraft, but the wings were built here. And again, excuse me, taken to Toulouse in France to be fitted to the fuselages. As a result of that, there were rather more of these built than anything else. Now, this is last month's numbers taken off the relevant websites. But you can see that as of August this year, the Airbus A320 have built 11,618 A320 series. I should add, it's not just the A320, it's the A318, 319, 320 and 321, but it's basically the same aircraft with a fuselage that's either longer or shorter. In 2019, the Airbus A320 overtook the Boeing 737, which is its major competitor, as the most ordered airliner ever. Now, you'll have noticed that the Boeing 737 had a 20-year advanced start on the A320, so that's pretty good going, isn't it? And in terms of the latest version, the A320 is now the A320 Neo, which stands for New Engine Option, because it's got bigger and more efficient engines, whereas Boeing's are lumbered with the 737 MAX, and that's had all sorts of problems. So these numbers are likely to go on increasing. But I mean, the point I want to make is that the sheer scale of this is sadly one of the reasons why in 1989, right at the end of December 89, what by then was the British Aerospace factory here at Brooklands closed down for the last time, because it just could not compete on this scale. Challenge 2 was the short runway, of course, which meant that almost every post-war aircraft that was built here was flown out to Wisley, 6 miles down the road, which had a much longer runway and could be tested there. So that's really the potted history that I wanted to cover in terms of why we are here celebrating a book and why we have this wonderful museum here. Let me just go through the timeline of the museum, because again this will be familiar, I'm sure, to most of you. In 1967, when the factory was still churning out VC-10s, Vanguards, the Brooklands Society was established in recognition that the site here was worth keeping, was worth celebrating, and needed to be properly documented as well. So they kind of started the thing going. In 1977, there was rather a significant exhibition held which focused on the aviation side of Brooklands. It was curated by a woman called Morag Barton. I've never met her. Tamily, have you met her? I wish I'd met her, and maybe I will at some stage, but she was the curator. She was in the Weybridge Museum, so she was the instigator of this exhibition, and it really raised the public knowledge of what had been going on here and what was worth preserving. And the next significant thing to happen was that Gallagher's, which was a big tobacco company, bought 40 acres of what was then the diminishing site here at Brooklands to build a new European headquarters. And because they only needed 10 acres of that, they very generously leased at a peppercorn rent 30 acres of the site to Elmbridge Council for the purposes of developing a museum. This is the 30 acres. This is quite a nice drawing I found of the museum site, but you can kind of see the surroundings of the 30 acres, which goes up to the track and so on. And of course, we're about here on this particular drawing. What happened next was that 3 years later, the Brooklands Museum Trust was created. And that led in 4 years' time to the Brooklands Museum first opening to the public, with Morag Barton as the first curator, director. I can't remember what she was called. And that was the point at which some of the aircraft were across the river. So it was a kind of split site. The public car park was on this site, not across the river. So it was a bit of a smaller affair, but nonetheless, that was the start of it. 2006 was another significant year when the Concorde, which had come here in bits some years before, was finally got back together again and opened to the public as the kind of centerpiece of the museum. Also in 2006, Mercedes-Benz World, who Mercedes-Benz had bought another part of the site, opened their museum sales office. I'm never quite sure what it is, but it's an interesting place to visit. And does give quite a good view over the previous airfield. 2010, the 30 acres of site was donated to the museum by Japan Tobacco International, which is what the company that had taken over Gallagher's. So at that point, the Museum Trust owned the site, which was, I'm sure, good news in terms of securing the future of it. 2011 was the London Bus Museum. That had previously been occupying part of the wartime site at Fox Warren, which is between here and Cobham. They had one of the hangars, but that site was sold to, I think, produce an old people's home, if I remember, care home. And the museum, Bus Museum, built its own building here on the site. And in 2017, of course, we were able to open the aircraft factory project funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. So today we have, of course, a thriving museum, about 70 staff. Mary and I were discussing what that number really is, but 70, 75. There are 750 volunteers on the book. I won't say those are all active, but there are. And I should also say that there are about 7,500 Brooklands members as well supporting the museum. Quite a neat numbers of a factor of 10 in each, which makes it fairly easy to remember. So this is the current site drawing, rather a nice drawing, and that of course translates to the reality, which was a drone picture I found of the museum site too. And again, we are currently in this part of the building here. And lots of people there enjoying themselves, and even some aircraft out on the finishing straight, which is also always good to see. I'm going to come to me now, because I've talked about the history, I've talked about the museum, but how did I come to get involved? Well, I've always had a passion for planes, and I'll explain briefly why. And I'm going to start with this picture, which actually I took, I think, when I was about 11 or 12 at Biggin Hill. And to me, the interesting thing is the aeroplane. This is a rather lovely de Havilland biplane called a Dragon Rapide. And this particular one, India Foxtrot, built in 1944 for the Royal Air Force, still flying today at Duxford. And I think you can go and fly in it. It's with classic wings. You've done it? Yeah, me too. We've done it? We've done it. Yep. So, wonderful aeroplane. When this picture was taken, it was owned by a flying club at Biggin Hill called the Surrey and Kent Flying Club, almost inevitably known as the Surrey and Bent Flying Club, of course. And these gentlemen here were the flying instructors. That's why I took the picture. They wanted their picture taken together. I can't remember all of their names, but I'm pretty sure this tall guy here was inevitably called Tiny Marshall. And I think this chap here was a fellow called Peter Chin, who is fairly well known, or was fairly well known in aviation circles. But I actually want to focus on this chap here, who is standing at ease in true Royal Air Force style. He is actually, or was, one of my great uncles. His name was Gordon Carey. I should say, I never knew my paternal grandparents. They died long before I was born, but I was quite lucky in having a number of great uncles and aunts, some of whom didn't have any children of their own and were quite happy now and then to adopt me as a kind of temporary grandchild. Gordon Carey here, when he left the Air Force at the end of the war, he joined an organisation called Island Air Services, which was a charter airline operating out of what we then called London Airport, now Heathrow, of course. And in 1955, at the age of 4, he piloted me on my first ever flight in an aeroplane. It was actually in one of these. It was actually in a Dragon Rapide, the sort of sister of this, not this one, but one that is also still flying, as it happens. They're obviously long-lasting, these Rapides. So he took me up on my first flight, but then when Island Air Services ceased flying in the late 1950s, he became a flight instructor at the Surrey and Kent Flying Club. I should have told you that one of the things he did in the RAF was teach Douglas Bader to fly, the legless ace. So he was quite a good flying instructor, I have to say. You might say if he was any better, then Douglas Bader would not have had the crash that injured him. But there we go. During the school holidays at Biggin Hill, he used to take me up in a whole variety of light aircraft in my early teens to show me how to fly them. And that was pretty lucky. I mean, a whole range of aeroplanes, from Air Coops to Pipers to Chipmunks, all sorts of things. So it was a great introduction. That's why I got passionate about flying in the first case. Gordon Carey here had a sister called Una, and she was married to this chap. Now, this is a fellow called Dermot Boyle, and he, as you can see, was in the Royal Air Force. He was actually the first Cranwell candidate to become Chief of Air Staff. And that was something that Lord Trenchard, the founder of the RAF, was rather proud about, because he said the RAF will only come of age when a Cranwell candidate becomes Chief of Air Staff. And Dermot Boyle did that at the beginning of 1956. Interesting chap. 5 days after becoming Chief of Air Staff, he got into a Canberra bomber and flew himself around all the overseas Royal Air Force bases, except for Australia, because he could. He wanted to go and see them. He then had the Suez crisis to deal with. He was in charge of the airborne side of that. But at the end of 1959, he stopped being Chief of Air Staff. He used to tell me that he did not retire, because Marshals of the Royal Air Force never retire. They're simply taken off the active list. But when he did retire, he did two very interesting things. One was to initiate and to become the first chairman of trustees of the Royal Air Force Museum, because that was something that was one of his passions, was to develop a museum to recognise the Royal Air Force and everything it did, initially in Hendon. And in fact, part of the Hendon site, or part of the museum, is called after Dermot Boyle, Sir Dermot Boyle, as he became. The other thing he did was to join the board of the British Aircraft Corporation, and he became its vice chairman, based here at Brooklands. And I think it was probably due to him, or thanks to him, that I did get the chance as a late teenager to spend a week here doing work experience and watching VC-10s being carved out of solid metal over in the works down the other side of the airfield. What I'm trying to say is with these two guys, it was pretty inevitable that I should enjoy things that go up in the air. And this is the best picture I could find of a recent one. This is me standing next to a Robinson R-22 helicopter, which one of my sons and I tried flying a few years back. Quite an interesting experience, and one that I can recommend if you're prepared to kind of unlearn any normal flying you might have done, because helicopters are a bit different in that it's all very well, but if you ever let go, you're dead. Whereas a normal aeroplane generally keeps on flying, at least for a bit. A bit of a health and safety warning too is that that's not a great pose to adopt if there's any danger of the helicopter taking off. With all that as my background, I was inevitably going to become a pilot, but unfortunately my eyesight was not good enough. And I did try to get into Hamble, which was the air training college for BEA and BOAC, but no, they said your eyesight's got to be better than that. I then kind of tinkered around with doing aeronautical engineering, but surprisingly, in spite of having been taught mathematics by Thomas Sopwith's cousin, believe it or not, my maths wasn't terribly good, and it was fairly obvious that I was going to struggle on that. So Bristol University, where I was all headed to do aeronautical engineering, let me move to architecture instead, which was fine. So I spent about 12 years doing architecture. And thanks to Google Street View, I was able to find the other day 2 buildings that I designed at the time that are still standing. This is a little health centre in Richmond upon Thames. More significantly, these are houses in Milton Keynes. We designed 3 houses in Milton Keynes that were designed to be very low energy consuming houses, which in the early 1980s was a fairly radical thing to do. I think British Gas sponsored them, if I remember, and I think they had prototype condensing boilers in them, which of course are all the rage now. But the point is that they were also the first buildings that we designed in the practice using computers. I'd argued that we should install a computer drafting system, which in the 1980s involved dishing out about 60,000 quid on a computer that had 2 megabytes of memory, and we were grateful. But that led to a rather strange coincidence in 1985 when I met someone who worked for this company that you might have heard of, IBM. I think then, and maybe even now, it was the world's largest computer company. And this chap, he said to me, have you ever, Nigel, thought about joining IBM? Because they want to recruit people who understand computer-aided design, and you seem to do that. Having told him that, why should someone who'd never worn a suit in his life, had hair down to his shoulders, and was not really typical IBM fodder? And he said, well, I'll tell you why. He said, if I recruit you into IBM, I get a crate of rather good champagne. So we had a little discussion about that, and the end result was that we shared the champagne and I got the job in IBM, which was great because I did spend a couple of years talking about computer-aided design to various IBM customers. But IBM, being what it was, quickly changed jobs and ended up doing international roles. And I mention that only because it was the start of clocking up an insane amount of air miles, some of which I've still got, I think, and probably ought to spend. Another coincidence, in 1999, when I was called up by a former IBM colleague who'd moved to this company, Logica. This is a name that I know is at least familiar to one person in the room, Pete, isn't it? Was a fairly large international British IT company. And I moved to there and spent another 16 years, again, in international roles, racking up air miles and doing rather nerdish things like seeing if I could fly in every type of every model of every airliner that was currently flying, which I nearly but not quite managed. 2015 I retired, and that really is the key point because that's when I joined Brooklands Museum as a volunteer. Literally, I think it was the day after. My last day was a Friday and I started work here on a Saturday, doing 2 days a month as a volunteer steward. The reason for mentioning that is that between 2015 and 2018, I had a lot of time to learn about Brooklands, but also to get feedback from the visitors. And a lot of the remarks from the visitors were along these lines. And these kind of add up to Brooklands Museum having been a fairly well-kept secret, frankly. I don't know what they thought these great big metal things out in the aircraft park actually were, because they're fairly visible, certainly from the railway line. But anyway, this showed that there was a lot of work that could be done on making the place more familiar to visitors. In 2018 was when Tamerlane started, the beginning of 2018. And we had a volunteers meeting with Sir Gerald Asher to introduce Tamerlane. And I remember at the end of it, he said to us, by the way, if any of you got any ideas of how to make the museum even better, please let Tamerlane know. Now that was, I needed no more encouragement, I have to confess. And as Tamerlane knows, a couple of months later, I started deluging her with some ideas of what I thought we might be doing. And one of the things that was guiding me was this. Now, this may be familiar to you, but this guy, Neil McGregor, was the director of the British Museum. And in 2010, he wrote the most remarkable set of broadcasts for BBC Radio 4, titled A History of the World in 100 Objects. And he literally took 100 things, as he called them, from the British Museum collection to explain world history in a series of episodes. I mean, it was brilliant. It was fantastic listening. 15 minutes, I think, per object. And you can still get them on not iPlayer, but whatever the radio equivalent is. And it was a book too. It was turned into a book. And I thought, well, maybe that could work for the museum. And I developed a pitch. Now, the original idea was that they would be 50 objects, because I didn't think that I could probably find 100 in the museum to explain the story, but 50 might be more doable. So this was, I think, a presentation or a pitch that we began to take round, obviously to Tamerley, to Alex and others, to see if it was an idea that resonated. But also, I did a bit of architecture stuff as well, the odd idea. Do you remember that one, Tamerley? You do. Just to see how we might get at least some of the aircraft under cover. Haven't done it yet, but, still hoping. But what I wanted to do was this guy. Now, this is Tim Collins. Tim, I'd been hoping was going to be here today. Sadly, he couldn't make it, unfortunately. But Tim was a consultant for the museum at the time. He was working on basically exploiting the museum's brand. He heard about this idea, and he kind of took me in hand and said, look, if you want any help, I'm in marketing and branding. He was invaluable. I think I can honestly say that without Tim, and I'd be embarrassing him if he was here, the book probably wouldn't have happened, because he had the knowledge, he had the contacts. And one of the things that he and I did was go to the London Book Fair in 2019 to talk to some publishers and kind of see what was what on this idea of a book. And it was from that we eventually met up and got some very positive vibes from Pen and Sword Books. Pen and Sword Books is based up in Barnsley in Yorkshire, but they are a huge publisher of history books, on generally on military stuff, but also on aviation, shipping and so on. And we got talking to them about this idea and whether we could make it fly, literally. They said, well, yes, okay, let's talk about this. So during 2020, and this wasn't easy, it was kind of remote discussions given what was beginning to go on in 2020 with the pandemic. The first thing they said was, look, I'm sorry, it's got to be 100 objects because we only publish books that have got 100 objects in the title. So we said, okay, fine. I had to change the rules. So those objects would not be ones that were only in the museum. They would actually be ones that were relevant to the Brooklands story, but could be viewable somewhere else in the UK, generally in another museum somewhere. We agreed what the target audience would be. This would not be a technical manual, it would not be an expanded guidebook, it would be actually for general interest, for the sort of visitors that were making those comments that I showed earlier. They defined the size, this wonderful pinched crown quarto, a wonderful term for whatever it is, 117 millimeters wide or something. That it would be in hardback and that the digital versions would follow. Actually, in the end, we did it the other way round, but that was for other reasons. Double page per object. Again, this was kind of following their standard design in many ways, but crucially, 500 words. Now, I've got something to say about that later, but that was a bit of a challenge, frankly. But that was defined by the design of the page. That I would do separate biographies for the designers. There were going to be 6, not 5, because Tom Sopwith demanded to be included, quite rightly. And much to my surprise, they said I could write it. Right up until that point, we had been assuming that we would get a professional author to write it. But for some reason, they thought, probably from the barrages of emails that I'd written to them about it, that I could probably give it a go. So that's how I came to get more intimately involved than I'd perhaps anticipated. And this was the result. So it is a history of aviation at Brooklands in 100 objects. It does include 303 pages. These are just, I've counted all the words. It's nearly 87,000, which is rather more than anticipated. I think the contract, if I remember, said 50,000. So they got a good deal there. And in the end, 369 illustrations. I should say now, actually getting the illustrations together was more difficult than the writing. Writing is relatively straightforward once you've grappled with 500 words and so on. Finding the right illustrations, finding the credits for those illustrations was a real challenge. And of course, we didn't have unlimited funds to go and buy illustrations. So a lot of them either I took or begged borrowed from the Royal Air Force Museum and so on. But we got there, and 369 I think is about the right count. It is, as they say in the trade, profusely illustrated. Divided into 7 episodes. This is simply to divide it up into time frames. I could have called them chapters, I suppose, but it didn't seem quite right. So episodes it was. The 6 biographies. This was a fairly obvious list with one exception. When I first started hawking this around, people said, oh yeah, Thomas Sopwith, heard of him. They even had heard of Rex Pearson, a lot of them. But we then got down, Sidney Cam, yes. Stanley who? Now Stanley Hooker actually is the one person that wasn't based here in some form or other. He's actually an engine designer, mathematician by background, but he had a fantastic involvement in the development both of the Merlin engine and of the subsequent jet engines when he was working both for Rolls-Royce and Bristol Siddeley. And he came up with developing the Harrier engine, for instance, the Olympus and so on. He had to be in the list, really, for what impact he had on the stuff that went on here. Crucially, the museum was to retain the copyright of the book. Now, this is very important because the idea is that the book sells in huge numbers and all the royalties go to the museum. And to do that, they had to retain the copyright, and that was written into the contract that Tamley and I and Pen and Sword developed. And rather more lately, we've been doing associated things such as doing stuff for BMTV, thanks to Mark at the back there. And also, I'm hoping we're going to have a leaflet at some stage, aren't we, with the objects on, so that people... Oh, that's an A400, by the way, if anyone wanted to know. Unmistakable noise. A leaflet that people can take around the museum spotting all the objects. That should work quite well, I hope. I'm just going to show very briefly because, yeah, I'm running out of time quickly. Just a few of the pages of some of the more slightly obscure objects. So we had Sopwith sewing machine. Early aeroplanes were covered in linen, doped linen. So a lot of dressmakers' skills went into cutting out and forming that linen around the various aerodynamic surfaces. And inevitably, you needed one of these, which was a fairly standard Singer sewing machine. This happened to be, it's one of the ones on display in the aircraft factory that belonged either to Tom Sopwith's sister or to the wife of one of his workmen. I haven't quite worked out which is the true story, but it's a standard Singer sewing machine. And I've used this actually to tell the story of Singer sewing machines because it's quite interesting that they built the largest ever sewing machine factory in Glasgow. And they also invented hire purchase. And those two things meant that everyone could have Singer sewing machines. Brilliant story. Then we've got Beatrice Schilling's Gold Star. Now, I love this story. It's a trinket. These are tiny. They're about that big. And they were given to people who could go around the circuit on a motorbike and lap at more than 100 miles an hour. And of course, it was mostly the chaps that were doing this. Except that in the 1930s, there were 2 women, Florence Blenkiron and also Beatrice Schilling, who were able to do it. And here's Beatrice on her Norton here, on the finishing straight, actually. And she managed to do it. And we know this is her gold star because it's got her name on the back. Beatrice Schilling went on to work at Farnborough. And her fame was actually because she devised a very quick fix for the Merlin engine to stop it stalling in negative G when aircraft were going upside down. And she used to go around on her motorbike with these little washer things, personally installing them in Spitfires and Hurricanes. Extraordinary woman. She went on to do a lot of other things at Farnborough as well. But it all started here, driving at 100 miles an hour around the circuit. Then we've got a golf club. Anyone play golf? Anyone been to Burr Hill? You know Burr Hill? So when the Luftwaffe raided Brooklands in September 1940 and sadly killed nearly 90 people, the decision was made that a lot of the facilities here had to be made remote. And they took over Claremont House, which is where the Hawker design team under Sidney Cam went, and they took over Burr Hill Golf Club, which is where Rex Pearson and Barnes Wallis went. So the bouncing bomb was actually basically designed on a very large drawing board in the squash courts of Burr Hill Golf Club. And I thought it was rather a nice story because I'm told, I don't play golf, but I'm told that there is a golf stroke called a Barnes Wallis, which is where you bounce your ball off water. And the story here is that a golfer called John Rahm did it at Augusta in 2020 and got a hole-in-one by bouncing it off the water feature onto the green and into the hole. So it's rather nice that the bouncing bomb was designed in a golf club. Supersonic wind tunnel. This picture was taken about here, because the supersonic wind tunnel came through the wall here. I'm not sure if that's in exactly the right place, but if you go around the other side, you can see where the hole was. And where we are now was this idea of a wind tunnel that could achieve supersonic speeds. And it was the result of a bit of lateral thinking that involved using the stratosphere chamber next door, which was basically a giant vacuum tank to suck air in from a great big balloon of dry air that was in the room next door. I've momentarily forgotten what it's called. Thank you. Well, balloon hanger, yes, but what is it now? McLaren. The McLaren shed. So, yeah, this is where all this happened, and it worked very well. Mach 4 times the speed of sound for a few seconds, but it was enough to test missiles and supersonic aircraft, and it was here. And finally, it's a shame Mike Bannister's not here. I love telling this story. I said earlier, Concorde had two challenges. One was to fly very fast, and the other was to fly slowly enough to land on normal airport runways. Making it fly fast was the easy bit, really. And there were two aerodynamicists at Farnborough who devised the wing shape for the Concorde. One of them was called Dietrich Kuschemann. And Dietrich Kuschemann had been working in an aerodynamics institute in Germany during the war, basically modelling high-speed airflows. And the Germans were pretty darn good at that, I have to say. After the war, Dietrich Kuschemann came over, or was encouraged to come over to the UK to work at Farnborough. A few months later came his assistant, who was a woman called Joanna Weber. Joanna Weber was a very, very good mathematician. She was, by all accounts, a very shy person. She didn't like taking the limelight at all, but she turned out to be an extremely good high-speed aerodynamicist. And Kuschemann and Weber, between them, refined the Concorde wing for high-speed flight. But, as I said, Concorde also had to fly slowly. And for a delta wing to fly slowly, it has to fly at quite a high angle of attack, i.e. nose up. which is why Concorde's got a drooping nose, by the way, so that the guys in front can actually see. But the problem is that you're very near stalling when you're flying at a high angle of attack, because the lift breaks down on the top of the wing. What Joanna Weber came up with was what's going on here. And if you look closely at the sharp leading edge of the Concorde wing, it's very slightly drooped. Very, very, very slight, but it is drooped down. And she had worked out that if you did that at a high angle of attack, the wing would generate a vortex, like a whirlwind, over the top of the wing, going round and round and round. And that whirlwind, that vortex, would create lift, because a vortex has low pressure. And on a wing, you want high pressure underneath, low pressure on top, and guess what? It goes up. She worked that out. It was non-intuitive, but she was able to model it. And they eventually tried it out and found that she was right. And that was the reason why the Concorde was able to land stably at normal landing speeds and normal airport runways. The Russians, who allegedly stole the Concorde plans and produced the Tupolev 144, missed that bit. Ho ho. And the Tupolev 144 in the end, to land slowly, had to have things called canards built into the front to keep it under control, and they never worked terribly well. So we have this woman to thank for that. Joanna Weber lived to the age of 104. Spent all her life working at Farnborough. As I say, she didn't claim any of the limelight. It was Dietrich Kuschelmann, her boss, in inverted commas, who said that she was the one that came up with this idea for the droop leading edge. And in fact, I've got a rather long recording, an oral history recording that we've got, which I'm in the process of transcribing, which is her recollections of working at Farnborough. I'm looking forward to getting that done because it's quite fascinating. Anyway, one of my heroes. That's it. Some lessons learned. Well, there's no such thing as a perfect list of 100. Someone was asking me earlier about how did I make up the list? Well, you know, you make up a list and then you change it and then you ask people's views and they come up with some other ideas. I actually finalised the list about a month before I finished writing the book because I had some things that I thought I might include, things I didn't. Anyway, in the end you have to go with it. It will never be perfect, it will never suit everybody, but it is what it is. When I started doing research, everyone said, don't use Wikipedia, it's rubbish, always wrong. Well, it's not. Actually, there are some really good Wikipedia articles. But you have to just treat it as a first step. Its reference lists are usually the most useful thing, because then you can go into source material. So I was very, very grateful for Wikipedia, at least for starting off certain things. But I also discovered that autobiographies are not always right. Now, I'm not going to name names, but there were two particular autobiographies I read where I suddenly came across things that just didn't stack up at all. They were dates that just didn't work. And in the end, I had to go all the way around it to find out that, yes, indeed, it was wrong, and that someone, in writing their autobiography, had misremembered a date, to be kind. I mean, there are other things in autobiographies where people claim to have done things that they haven't, but that's another problem. I'm told it was Blaise Pascal who once wrote, I was going to write you a short letter, but I didn't have time, so I've written you a long one instead. Other people have claimed that quote, but it's absolutely right. If you sit down to write something, 1,500 words is easy, 500 words is much more difficult. But I was stuck with 500 words, and I didn't always succeed, which is why some objects in the book have 4 pages and not 2. What else did I learn? Yeah, by no means everything is online. Everyone says, you know, you can get everything online now. Well, no, you can't. There are certain books and source information that is only available in hard copy. And that's why my bookshelves at home are now double stacked, and there are piles on the floor as well. Because, you know, there's sometimes no alternative to actually getting the hard copy information. Yes, no, I'm glad there's no one from Pen and Sword here, because I have discovered that there are one or two tiny little things that are not quite right in the book, as it turned out. Nothing major, I hasten to add, but I've had some interesting discussions with Brooklands members about certain pictures, for instance, and turned out that they weren't perhaps taken where either I or the caption thought they were. But that's, you can't get round that. Hopefully you get most of the errors out. Now, 369 illustrations. The largest chunk of illustrations, the largest section, were actually taken by me. And they were photographs, well, illustrations or photographs taken either here at Brooklands or elsewhere, be it Hendon, Cosford, you name it. The challenge with museums, and Tamily, if I may say, and you know this only too well, is that you never have enough space to actually display what you've got. You could always do with more space. And that means that museums, the aircraft, the engines are usually stacked up such that it's quite difficult to take a picture of them without getting other things in the way. And I thought I'd just show one example. This is a remarkably fine specimen of Harrier at the RAF Museum at Cosford. But as you can see, it's in a rather badly lit old hangar. There's clutter around it. There's a jet provost snuffing around at the back there. And, it kind of distracts from it. The lighting is not perfect. It's a bit dark. But with Coral Paint Shop Pro, and I should say in true BBC style that other photo editing software suites are available, like Photoshop, but I happen to like Coral, you can just do that. And that does make a huge difference for producing illustrations. Sometimes I did that, sometimes I would take the background out completely, just depended on what the subject was. But to be able to do that relatively easily was a huge boon, really. That, as they say, is that.
Take this opportunity to thank Nigel, the wonderful Nigel, with his wonderful book. I think we can all agree that it's fascinating and that the time that Nigel has spent with us this afternoon has also been really interesting to get that further insight into the book.
Will you indulge me? I'm so sorry. It's like I come back here and I can't not stand up at the front.
Fantastic.
But Nigel has been so modest about this, and I just want to say that this was such a good idea, and as so much of what happens at Brooklands, it couldn't have been taken on if a volunteer hadn't been willing to do it. There's 6.5 years of work, but I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't more like full-time work in this book. There's no way the museum would ever have the resources to do that. There's been so much research, there's been so many fascinating things being uncovered that we didn't know, so much fact-checked and brought together that some people knew, but other people thought the version was different, and all of this. And Nigel's done all of this with a huge amount of grace, determination, but in a very elegant way, to keep this project going through the whole COVID period when, the museum was fighting for its life. And Nigel kept this going and was so generous and gentle in the way you interacted with me when you needed things to just be able to move it along without it becoming just another overwhelming demand at that very difficult stage. And I'm so grateful for that, because otherwise it might not have continued. And now we have this fantastic book, and Brooklands Museum is all about sharing the Brooklands story with as many people as possible, and it's so valuable to have lots and lots of different ways of doing that, and a book is such a good way of doing it, and it's not something we've had like this. And a book that's aimed to be readable for a general audience but fascinating to everybody is exactly what I would have wanted, although it was absolutely Nigel's idea, not mine. So I'm so grateful to you for seeing this through, and it's enormously generous of you to have given the copyright to the museum, even though it's all your words in it, because that does mean that there will be something that contributes to the museum for a long time to come. So I just want to say Nigel's been hugely modest about this. He's enormously erudite, very determined in a very graceful and generous way, and we can't thank him enough. So
very kind, thank you.